think, all of us are born artists in a way. Most of us have a lot of that kind of squeezed out of us by society by the time we are adults. We're all socially conditioned in order to function in society, to be more practical minded and to be more focused on making money. And that's useful in its way. But if we're limited to that narrow focus, I think we miss out on most of life. We miss out on the very, very larger picture. That reality is a much bigger realm than the sort of rational order that we are taught.
Hello, sweet friends. Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I am your host, as always, Mara James, and this week is really cool. We get to hang out with Tom Patterson. I met Tom in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where he lives, at his house, which is also called the Nerve Museum. And we had a conversation in his garret at his desk where he said he spent large parts of his life, which I think is evidenced by his incredibly prolific body of work. Tom is kind of the go-to guy for writing and curation about outsider art or folk art. And I've spoken about this a bit before in the episode with Jim White, but outsider art is essentially any kind of art that's being created outside of an academic or marketplace context, which, sidebar, I would call art, full stop. And that other thing we should start calling academic art. These are people that are just making art for their own motivations. And a lot of times because they've had some kind of visionary experience, some kind of communication with the other side, with other planes of consciousness, and they are on a mission and have devoted their life, and oftentimes, particularly with Howard Finster and St. Ohm, two artists that Tom has kind of written the preeminent biographies on, they've actually created incredible built environments and turned their homes and yards into complete experiences, other universes that it's possible to step into and be transformed. There's an artist named Felipe Benito Archuleta who creates these really cool, almost life-sized animal sculptures that he carves out of wood. And he says, I ask God for some kind of miracle, some kind of a thing to do, to give me something to make my life with. I started carving, and they just came out of my mind after that. Tom has gotten to know a lot of these artists personally. He started this work in the 70s and 80s when he had a small press in Atlanta. And I'm so grateful for people like him that have done the work to help bring these people's spirit out into the world, because unlike quote unquote mainstream artists, a lot of them don't have access to the channels that we get to know many other artists through. And it's really vital that people like Tom curate, as he has at museums all around the country, to help give some of these artists the platform that they more than deserve. We talk a lot in this conversation about mental illness, about the trauma that can sometimes go into the kind of visionary experiences that change the course of these artists' lives. And I just have the feeling that in other societies that are not so traumatized as our current Western culture is, that these kind of artists would be given a really sacred place. These are people that are helping bring into the human plane of light, color, and symbol transmissions from much more complex planes of consciousness, and bringing it into the sphere where we can all engage with it on emotional, non-linear, non-verbal levels. That's a deeply holy thing, a human need that we all have to commune with one another in that way. I feel this way about musicians too. It's a very sacred space to hold in human communities, to be able to connect us all to the same frequency and wavelength of emotional understanding. I feel that way about kids when I see kids drawing and making things and playing. We need that. That's what it means to be alive. That's what it means to be human. And when we turn that off as adults or run our imaginations through a limited number of socially sanctioned grooves for expression, we're denying ourselves our fundamental humanness. And that's a shame. And it shows in the ways that we suffer, in the ways that we feel unknown, unseen, unseeable, these insurpassable voids of understanding that we experience between individuals and between cultures. I don't think that's normal or necessary. This conversation with Tom opened up in a really beautiful, surprising way about his own visionary experiences and the entheogenic plants that have helped him open his mind and his soul as a young man. And I don't think it's a coincidence that psychedelic experiences often go hand in hand with the kind of transcendent art that we're talking about. I think psychedelics help remove a lot of the "this isn't important" filters from your brain, and that can go for the creative experience as well, and all the layers of judgment and expectation that we can place on ourselves as creative beings, rather than realizing that the creative force is a form of prayer. It's not just a means to an end product, but listening and honoring the transmissions that come through us in whatever medium is part of the humility of being a human incarnate that has this antenna to greater consciousness. And I think anything that we can do to honor those instincts in ourselves and in the people that have devoted their lives to it and showing all of us that it's possible is vital, especially at this time in our evolution as a human species, when so many of our institutions and authorities are telling us that transmission is beside the point, or a hobby that you kind of tuck in around the other stuff. If you want to reach out to Tom, I highly recommend you do so. He's very available, and his email is in the description for this episode. He also has a memoir coming out, and after our conversation, he read an excerpt from it. He's really devoted his life to telling the stories of visionary artists, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you've definitely read his work before. If you'd like to see some of his personal collection at the Nerve Museum, you can check it out on my Instagram. Daniel, my partner, made a very sweet little trailer for this episode that includes some selections of what's hanging up on the walls of his place. So, in the words of Howard Finster, let's get on the altar. Here is Tom Patterson. So two of the main artists that you've really focused on, Finster and St. EOM, are both Georgia-based, and I feel the sort of folk art spirit so strongly in the South. Do you feel like those things are connected?
I think the climate has a lot to do with it. The fact that people spend a lot of time outdoors here, and both actually he pronounced it St. Ohm.
St. Ohm.
And Howard Finster both created pretty elaborate environments around their rural homes in Georgia. And both of these places were in pretty remote territories. So if you happen to come on them just unawares, it was like you felt like you'd sort of dropped through the rabbit hole. It was like, what in the world is this and what is it doing here? And that was definitely my feeling in both cases, although their reputations preceded them. I met both of those guys in 1980, and I was just really blown away by the environment that St. Ohm had built, and by him as a personality. He was quite a character, and it extended to the way he dressed and the way he his whole self-presentation. He was in his 70s at that time, which seemed quite old to me. I was still in my late 20s. He had been building this place for like 30 years around what was originally just an old farmhouse that had belonged to his mother that he had inherited along with the 4 acres of property. A few months later, I went to visit Howard Finster, who lived about 125 miles north of there. They were both within easy driving distance of Atlanta, where I lived at the time. Howard Finster was a very different kind of character. He was a backwoods sort of Baptist preacher, but not a conventional preacher at all. He had vivid visionary experiences. He claimed to travel to other planets in his visions, and he would have been considered crazy by a lot of his neighbors, I think. And he had built this environment in the swamp behind his house, mostly out of junk that he collected. He was quite handy as a brick mason and using cement to make sculpture. And he started painting, and he started hanging his paintings up in the trees. And by the time I visited his place in 1980, he had been working on it for almost 20 years, and it was just incredibly elaborate, a very different kind of, much more cluttered and chaotic kind of environment than St. Owens, much more ordered situation. But anyway, they were both very interesting characters. I ended up writing extensive books about both of them in the early 1980s. By the time I finished work on that book, Finster had become a very well-known figure. He had appeared in an REM video and had designed an album cover for Talking Heads. That was a very big selling album. And so suddenly, in addition to his art audience, suddenly there was this whole rock music world that was turned on to him, and all these young fans of Talking Heads and REM were making pilgrimages to his house. And so he was quite a phenomenon by the late 1980s when I finished working on that book, and a New York publisher, Abbeville Press, picked that up. The St. Owen book has recently been reissued by the University of Georgia Press in a new edition. So those two books definitely that sort of put me on the map as somebody who, was very deeply involved in this work. Now, back to your original question about the South, it was certainly my perception at the time that the South had some sort of special, not exactly the market cornered on this kind of work, but there was certainly a lot of it. Both those guys are white. There's a whole deep tradition of African American yard show art in the South. That was a whole other thing that I was also aware of, and I've learned a lot more about it since then. It was a fairly small network of people who were interested in this kind of thing at the time. It has since expanded to, it's a global phenomenon now. And I gradually learned that there were things like this going on everywhere. Art making is a universal thing. There are some people, I think, that are just born to it, or something happens to them early in their lives, or, sometimes not until later in their lives that puts them on this path where they feel a compulsion to visually express themselves. Sometimes this is connected with deeper traditions, as is the case with the African American yard shows. And sometimes it's more of a strictly personal thing, and sometimes it's a combination of both. But I think because of the climate in the South, I think there's a lot more of this that's kind of out and visible. There's people doing these kinds of things in cities, but it's like hidden away in their little apartments, back in some little back garden, so that it's not really visible from the streets. In the South, when I was growing up, I was actually aware of these things when I was a child, because I would travel on vacation trips with my parents, who were both from Mississippi. I grew up in Georgia, and we made road trips to see relatives, and I would see these things in people's yards, and I was, always really fascinated by this, even before I knew to call it art, or before I had any real language for it. But it's definitely a universal phenomenon. There are incredible examples in India and France and in England, has a whole tradition of eccentric yard environments. All over Asia. There are amazing places in Latin America that are kind of hidden away that have been, discovered in more recent years. So it's a whole parallel art world, I would say. that really opened up to me when I began seriously looking for these things during my 20s.
Yeah, I'd love to unpack that a little bit. The idea that there's sort of capital A art as we're taught in sort of the mainstream culture, which exists in museums and people that are trained. What is, when we talk about visionary art or folk art or ecstatic art, do you see that as is that the same signal of human expression of creativity, or is there a different kind of channel that's being tapped into there?
Well, I think they overlap. In the formal art world and the academic art world, there's this kind of tradition that's built on. And so artists who are trained in that tradition, they take art history classes, and they're always making their art with an awareness of what has come before them. And a lot of times their art, will spin off of that, or, they can't do certain things because it's already been done. I was trained in a literary tradition, so I have that same thing coming from that angle. But I think that, real artists, whether they're trained academically or whether they have very little exposure to academic traditions, have a kind of internal spark. A lot of the other people that I met in the 70s and 80s who had taken an interest in these visionary artists and so-called folk or outsider artists were actually academically trained artists who would find out about these people that were making art without any reference to academia. And, they would be highly inspired by these people. They were like, wow. So a lot of the early collectors and scholars of what became known as outsider art came from within the academic tradition. And they were able to find some kind of a purity or passion or like vision in that work that they've often found lacking. And I think, all of us are born artists in a way. Most of us have a lot of that kind of squeezed out of us by society by the time we are adults. We're conditioned to be more practical minded and to be more focused on making money and working within the mainstream of society and all of that. I think there's some sort of kernel of that exists in all of us from the start. And it's just some of us are able to, by chance, by luck, by good fortune, are able to retain more of that and are able to continue to follow that thread beyond where it's kind of cut off in so many of us. Mm-hmm. That's my sense of it anyway.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you've learned from artists like Howard Finster who are having visionary experiences and what that connection is to source.
Well, again, like the art impulse, I think all of us have access to visionary consciousness and other levels of reality that we're socially conditioned to screen out. Any of us who have vivid memories of our childhood, I think if you really scratch that surface a bit and go back to your childhood, you can remember essentially visionary experiences that you had in that more innocent state. Times when you'd be, in your backyard by yourself and you would suddenly focus on some little minuscule detail in nature, an insect or something, and you could really go into a different world. I mean, I'm not exactly a 60s generation. I mean, I was 18 in 1970, but I was old enough in the 1960s to be affected by that whole cultural explosion that happened then, and the hippie movement. And although I grew up in a very small conservative southern town, I was like the artistic kid. I was in a rock band and, and I made art and I was a reader. So I was tapped into this other world, and I was kind of impatient to get out into the world and escape from my little contained realm there. And, the psychedelic thing was happening. I was very interested in Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert and Ken Kesey and all of those things, which I only read about. I didn't actually have any experiences with psychedelics until I was in my early 20s. And I found that very valuable as a way of kind of reconnecting with that visionary consciousness that I had, felt that I had experienced as a child. I would say in my 20s, that was extremely meaningful to me, and it still is. I still occasionally will take a psychedelic trip. I'll eat some mushrooms, or very rarely take acid. Don't seem to find very good acid these days, but mushrooms have been a very reliable. That was my first psychedelic experience when I was about 25. And in a lot of ways, I think that prepped me for really connecting with people like St. Ohm and Howard Finster. The first time I visited St. Ohm's place, it was like I had suddenly taken a huge dose of psychedelics without taking anything. It was just like suddenly you dropped into this other world and you saw things in a completely different way. You were able to access that visionary consciousness. So I think that's there for all of us. We're all socially conditioned in order to function in society to sort of narrow our focus. And that's useful in its way. But if we're limited to that narrow focus, I think we miss out on most of life. We miss out on the very, very larger picture. And the fact that reality is a much bigger realm than the sort of rational 1, 2, 3 ABC order that we are taught. So that's been a running thread in everything I've done. I think really, really serious, deep poets also tap into that realm. I think anybody who's involved in creative activity has experience of that world in one way or another.
It's almost like a valve, I feel like, and somebody like St. Ohm just has it wide open in the way that they're able to actually manifest it here in this realm.
Yeah, I think so. It helps to have some sort of a practice whereby you can access it. Certain types of meditation. I mean, I've been interested in Buddhism all my life. I, started reading Alan Watts when I was a teenager, and I was reading the Beat Writers, and so I learned about Zen, and you don't have to take drugs, you don't have to necessarily make art to access these realms, but I think it helps to have some sort of a practice that you can engage in if you're really focused in the kind of practical, ordinary world. If you're an accountant or a banker or a real estate agent, unless you have some other part of your life that you're able to use as a portal, it's very easy to just completely lose any focus on that larger picture.
Yeah, it's really my own experiences with psychedelics has really changed the way that I think about mental illness and what that means too, because I think we're scared, I think, culturally by people that do have a big open valve and aren't really sure what to do with those people. Yeah,
well, a lot of the people who are classified as mentally ill, I think, have, they have maybe access to those kinds of realms, but it's out of their control. They hear voices whether they want to or not. They see visions, sometimes really terrifying. It's not all like sweetness and light in that world. It's the whole gamut. You have access to the whole gamut of reality then. And some of it's quite terrifying. And some people are, seem to be, the nature of their consciousness seems to be such that they are uncontrollably stuck in the sort of dark part of that realm. And some of these people are also artists. There's a tremendous overlap between people who are great creative artists and also manic depressive or bipolar or schizophrenic. There's a whole history of famous artists who went off the deep end, or who maybe committed suicide or would go too deeply into that realm and it was too much for them. It's a bit of dark and light, certainly. It's a lot of dark and light.
It seems like a lot of these artists have had some kind of definitive moment or event where they got a message from a visionary plane that said, spread this spread this message. And it's usually, it seems like a message about unity and love at the end of the day. Does that seem resonant with what you found?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, St. Ohm had a foundational experience, and often it comes out of a serious trauma. He was, in his case, he was seriously ill, and he felt like he was dying. He was in his early 30s, and he had a pretty harrowing. He was a sharecropper's kid. Grew up very, very poor in a really remote little place in the South. Had a very cruel, brutal father, and he was probably gay. So he was a misfit in his way, just as I was a misfit in my little southern town. But he was born in 1908, and he was in a very remote little farming community. His family was very poor, and his father was abusive, and he just wanted to get out of there, and he knew he was different from everybody else. And so when he was like 14, he ran away from home to New York. Like a lot of young people who find themselves in that situation, he just kind of like gravitated to Times Square when he got to New York, and he fell into this life of prostitution from, his teens. So he was, selling his body as a way of making a living in New York. And it was a really interesting, amazing life that he had. But it was also quite harrowing and dangerous. His life was constantly at risk. He likes to say that it was from that experience that he was able to develop his psychic abilities. He actually made his living late in life as a fortune teller, as a psychic reader, as he called it. So he became like a sort of a drag queen in New York, and he made his living on his good looks. And so as he sort of aged out of that, he hit his 30s, and that was old for that line of work. Most of his clientele wanted like younger flesh. So I think he went through probably a sort of identity crisis at that time. Whether the identity crisis manifested itself as illness or whether he wasn't taking good care of himself physically. He ended up getting very, very ill. And he went back to Georgia. After his father died, he sort of reconnected with his mother, and he'd go back in the summer times to Georgia. She was able to buy this little farm there, and so he would go and help her with her little farm, and he was kind of recuperating from this illness. And he was back in Georgia at the time. He got very, very ill, and out of a fever or whatever, he had this experience where he saw this like huge character who like spoke to him, and really had like one of those earth-shaking kind of visionary experiences, saying, you can either die now or you can go back into the world and change your life. In the Bible, it's Paul's vision on the road to Damascus is one of those kind of experiences. Religious literature is full of those. And, the Buddha had his moment of enlightenment after period of extreme fasting, and he put himself through an incredible physical ordeal when suddenly the light came on. With Howard Finster, I think he was maybe like kind of always in touch with these things, but he definitely had a foundational experience when he was probably in his 40s, when he actually saw this giant character who appeared to him in his backyard and told him to get on the altar. And, it was a very enigmatic statement. He didn't really know what that meant. He had been preaching in churches, he was like a circuit preacher in these little rural churches all over northern Alabama and northwest Georgia. So he'd been like preaching the word of God and all of that. And this was obviously a command to do something beyond that. And he took that and started building this incredible environment in his backyard, like it was this compulsion that took him over. It wasn't a rational thing that he extrapolated from this command to get on the altar. He just picked up what was right in front of him and started doing these things. A dear friend of mine, a New York artist, very much, in the academic tradition, Leslie Dill, who was about my age, she had a foundational experience when she was probably 10 or 12 years old that she kind of forgot about at the time. And the way she described it to me was that she was in her, it was like one morning before school, she was in her bedroom. She was like waiting to go to school. It was a quiet moment. And she was like looking out at the leaves, the shadows of the leaves outside of her bedroom window, and started seeing these patterns, started having this kind of special meaning to her. And it was a very powerful experience that then she forgot about. And then years later, when she started making art, suddenly this came back to her. Although she came out of a more academic tradition, she's a New York artist and everything, suddenly she was able to tap into this profound visionary experience that she had had as a child and was able to remember it suddenly. And it all came back to her in a flash. And, everything that she has done since then has really kind of evolved out of that experience. With a lot of artists, if you really start talking to them, they will be able to trace what they do back to sometimes it's more than one experience, but a lot of times I think it's just one thing that happens to them. With some of the Southern artists that I've known who take up art like late in their life, they've had like a really like kind of practical career for years. They worked in factories or they farmed or whatever, and then something happens to them late in life where they're disabled or they're laid off from their job, and suddenly they have this time on their hands and they have a certain energy and they're able to tap into these kinds of things. So I don't think it necessarily has to happen at any certain point in your life. It can happen at any point. It's a matter of having the open valve, as you said, having the conduit to it. We all have that, but we don't locate it necessarily. Not everybody manages to locate it. Those of us who are fortunate enough manage to locate it and manage to have some control over it.
And the devotion to it, too.
Yeah. I think what happens is that for, real artist, real poet, it gives back to you. You put out this energy in order to make a thing, and it comes back to you, or you finish making a thing and you go, wow, did I make that? Incredible. And then it's like, wow, so I can do that. It can be a positive, very positive feedback loop.
I remember Tommy Unger, the illustrator, talking about how he looks at all of his past work as these strange children that have come out of him.
Yeah,
I love that.
I think, a lot of times it is like that. Wow, did I make that? I never knew Frank Zappa, but actually, after his death, I was curating an exhibition, and I ended up borrowing a piece of art from his wife for an exhibition I was curating at the American Visionary Art Museum in Baltimore by an artist named Eric White. And I happened to find out, that this particular piece was owned by Gail Zappa. And I was like, wow. So I was able to get Gail Zappa's phone number, and I called her up, and we had, a long conversation because I've been a huge fan of Frank Zappa since I was a teenager. And I was like, my favorite Frank Zappa, I love Frank Zappa's orchestral music. And I was like, my favorite Frank Zappa album is called Lumpy Gravy, and it was the first one where he like conducted an orchestra and everything. And she said, yeah, when Frank and I were listening to the recording of that, first listening to the recording of that, he was like, wow, did I make that? Did I write that? Even Frank Zappa, sort of a cynical character as he's known to be, without much use for, what does he call it, that cosmic debris. Even Frank Zappa had, I think any real artist has that experience at one time or another.
I'd love to, when you were mentioning the yard art from the African American tradition, I don't know much about that. Could you speak a little about that? Because I feel like there's so much music that comes out of the American Black experience that we're aware of, but I know there's a really rich visual tradition too.
So African spiritual traditions are very much about connecting with this other world and with spirit entities. And there are very specific, concrete, named, they're spirit entities, but they have personalities and there are ways to summon these people. The world is completely informed by spirits. I mean, this is not just, African, this is all shamanic traditions. You find the same thing in the pre-Buddhist Tibetan tradition. You find it certainly in the American Indian tradition, that everything's alive. There's no inanimate objects. That everything is very much alive and moving and changing all the time. And there are ways to tap into that. So in African religion, you have very specific ways to do that. And so there are visual components to that. A really well-known example that has been translated from Africa to the New World is the bottle tree. Now they're kind of like, people know about bottle trees now without really knowing what they are. It's like a tree with, a bunch of bottles stuck on the branches. Well, those are spirit catchers. So they're protective charms. So there's benevolent spirits in that tradition, and there's malevolent spirits. And there's things that you can do to cultivate the benevolent spirits, and there's ways that you can ward off the malevolent spirits. The bottle tree is a way of trapping the malevolent spirits. They go into the bottles. In the rural South, a lot of times you would see people wallpaper their interior walls with newspapers. And that has a practical component as insulation. But within the African American tradition, that's another way to trap spirits that you don't want coming into you. They get all involved in the print. They get like trapped in all those lines of type. There are certain types of charms that have traditional components. There's a great book I would recommend about all of this called Flash of the Spirit by Robert Ferris Thompson. He's actually a white scholar, but very, very deeply enmeshed in the African American tradition. And he wrote this incredible book called Flash of the Spirit that, I learned so much from. I've read it and reread it and reread it. And then there's a couple of huge books about Southern Black vernacular artists who work within these traditions called Souls Grown Deep. There's a whole Souls Grown Deep foundation out of Atlanta. There's a huge art collection that goes with that. So yeah, it's the African version of a kind of a universal shamanic way of viewing the world as being very much alive on all its levels. Within all of these traditions, there are identifiable spirits. There are ways to communicate with those spirits. There's a particular color of blue that you'll see painted on houses in certain rural African American communities they call haint blue. And it's a color that draws benevolent forces and repels negative forces. And the African word for that is haint, or haunt. It's anglicized from the slavery tradition. So all of that, has been brought to this world with the slave trade and everything. Just as in Latin America, when Catholicism spread to the Indians, well, the Indians kept their traditional gods. They just gave them the names of saints. And so the same thing happened with the African tradition. So voodoo is an example of that. It's probably the best known example of that. Voodoo is actually African religion, and where the names of these African gods and spirit entities are given Catholic names, and so they were able to, it's called syncretism. You're seeming to go with the dominant culture's traditions, but you're actually secretly following this whole other line of spiritual work. So.
That's interesting. We watched a documentary a few days ago called Little Saints, which is about a mushroom shaman, a woman in Mexico, and about 5 Westerners who come to sit with her. And in her ceremony, she has an altar which has pictures of Mary and Jesus and the Pope. And we were wondering if that would be challenging.
Was that Maria Sabina?
It wasn't, but she's very much in that tradition.
I met Maria Sabina.
No way.
Yeah, I went to Huautla in the 70s.
Wow, what was that like?
Oh, it was an incredible experience. This was like a few years after I had discovered psychedelic mushrooms, because I grew up in the South and they were like growing in the cow pastures. That's how I discovered them.
Oh, but you just picked them and ate them?
We picked them and ate them, yeah. But, after actually my brother sort of like figured out what they were, and then we started reading. It was like, oh, wow, this is like has a deep tradition. These things have been used for thousands of years in the New World. So my late younger brother, Hunter, spent a semester as an exchange student down at the University of the Americas in Cholula in 1975, and he had gone to visit Maria Sabina and spent some time in Huautla, the little Oaxacan mountain village where she lived. So he told me about it, and so then following year, I went down there and spent about 5 months traveling around southern Mexico and Central America. And, Huautla was definitely like a major place that I wanted to go check out. You could take a bus, this arduous, horrible bus ride up into Huautla, or you could go to the airport on certain days. You could pay a little money to the pilot, and he would ferry you up. And there was a little dirt landing strip on the side of the mountain just outside the village. And my brother said, now the plane will land, and just get out of the plane and somebody will come up and take care of you. And sure enough, like my friend that I was traveling with at the time, he and I arrived on the plane. This little kid, 8-year-old, 12-year-old kid comes up and introduces himself and says, I'm Santiago. You need a place to stay? Come to my house. Follow me. So we follow to his house. His father's a carpenter. They have a little group of huts up near the top of the village, and we pay them 50 cents a night to sleep in their corn crib. And, we sort of spent a few days there. And then as soon as we sort of set all of that up, he was like, you want mushroom? So they were used, there had been Westerners coming to do mushrooms for years, and hippies coming up there. I was a long hair and had a beard at the time. And, I was like, well, yeah, I'm really interested in trying these mushrooms, but I've done these mushrooms before, but I want to do them in a ceremonial context. So he introduced us to a curandera, and it wasn't Maria Sabina, but we went and found Maria Sabina, and I spent, an hour or so with her and talked with her, and then later that evening we did a mushroom ceremony and had a very profound experience there. So it was deeply meaningful. All of this goes into my memoir that I've been working on. So
what was the ceremony like? Was it based in Catholicism?
It was. So there's a young curandera who performed the ceremony. It took place in a little carpentry shop at night, and we were given like huge amounts of mushrooms. It was like my recollection, it was about the size of a brain, of a human brain, these tiny little mushrooms, and there were all these different types that grow around Huautla, and these were called derrumbe, which means landslide. And maybe because they grew where the land had fallen away, or because of some psychic component of it. It was like having a landslide experience in your brain or whatnot. But she had us eat all of these mushrooms. It was a tremendous dose, and we were in a candlelit little dirt floor carpentry shop. We were able to ask her questions. She didn't speak Spanish even. She spoke Mazatec, which was the native language, and the little kid that had taken our hand and brought us up there was our translator. So I knew enough Spanish. My friend didn't know much Spanish at all. So I would ask a question in Spanish. Santiago would ask her in Mazatec, and she would answer in Mazatec, and he would tell us, and I would say, so where do these mushrooms come from? Where do you think these mushrooms come from? And she said, well, the mushrooms are the blood of Jesus, was her way of talking about it. So we had candlelight at the early part of the ceremony. Then at a certain point, the candle was extinguished, and we were in almost complete darkness. There was a little bit of copal incense that was burning in a little censer. And so you could see this little kind of glowing pinpoint of light. And then throughout the ceremony, she was just singing. She was singing these songs that were in Spanish, and I could understand enough of it. She would say, Jesucristo, and I could understand enough of it to know that she was singing basically hymns that had Spanish lyrics and that were appeals to the saints. Of course, we were doing this ceremony to seek visions, locally, it's a much more practical thing. People will take the mushroom when they want to find some lost object, or it'll be a much more practical situation that they'll be consulting the mushroom about.
Wow.
But I certainly had profound visionary experiences there in the dark. For me, it was like that little glowing pinpoint of copal incense sort of painted these elaborate scenes in the darkness. These spectacular gardens, and this was during the rainy season. In the summer, there was a tremendous thunderstorm going on outside while this was going on. And at the end of the ceremony, we were still, very much under the influence. And she was nursing a sick infant, the whole time she was doing this ceremony for us. And whereas, if that hadn't been the case, she might have stayed with us for the whole night. It went on for hours and hours, and then she left and kind of left us to our own devices. And at that point, the thunderstorm had sort of subsided. We went outside, and we were way up at the top of the village. So we hadn't even been down into the main part of Huautla. We were up in the area right on the border of the forest. So we could look down and see the village, and there were electric lights, and so it was lit up. So the rain had stopped, but there was this fog. It was like you were up in the clouds, and these clouds would kind of lift up and cover the village, and then they would sink back down. So when they'd come up, all you'd see were these little pinpoints of light, and then the clouds would go back down again. And every time that happened, I would see a different architectural vista. I would see Moorish architecture one time. I would see Mesoamerican pyramids and so forth the next time. Each time it was like some elaborate architectural vision, but it changed every time. At one point I was looking down on an aerial view of my suburban neighborhood where I had grown up in Georgia, My friend asked me the next morning, he said, "Did you see the neon snakes last night?" And I was like, "No." He said, "They were all around your glasses. They were like these tiny little neon snakes just swarming around the frames of your glasses." So, one never knows what one sees. It's some sort of internal, you're seeing something that's inside of you. Mm-hmm. And expectations definitely play into the thing. It's a very, very powerful, profound experience for me. It's hard to talk about, except in terms of the visuals, because the visceral feeling that goes with it, the feeling of being literally turned on and electrified from within is a very hard thing to talk about. Mm-hmm. And this is true of, any time that I've had a good psychedelic experience. But I would say probably that experience in Huautla was the largest dose of psychedelics I've ever taken. And, plus I was in this, it was like being in another time. It was like going back in time in a lot of ways. Being out of the 20th century completely. You were in a traditional Indian community, very close to what an Indian community would have been pre-conquest times. That was my feeling about it. So it was a very alien world that I was in. While it was going on, I was like, this is always here. This realm is always here. I don't want to forget it. I want to be able to tap back into that when these drugs wear off. And you can't really do that, but also you can. If you have a powerful experience like that, even if you're no longer having the physical sensation and the electrified from within sensation, you remember those things. And, for me, it profoundly affected everything that happened, the way my life unfolded ever since then. I mean, that was my psychedelic year, really. It was 1975, 76. It was when I first really started having personal experiences with these things. And I really deeply went into it. And we could just go out at the time I mean, later I think the farmers figured it out and they started putting fungicides in their cow feed. So, suddenly you couldn't find them anymore. You'd go back into the same cow pasture where, like, the previous year, after a good rain, you would find hundreds of mushrooms. You'd be able to collect enough to turn on, lots of your friends, grocery bags full of them. And then suddenly they just weren't there anymore. But so I took full advantage of that during that period. And everything that kind of happened for me after that, I think, was very deeply informed by those experiences. And they've certainly helped me to understand when I would meet an artist like St. Ohm, and I felt the same way at Howard Finster's place, even though he was like a fundamentalist preacher in his way. He was a fundamentalist preacher who went to other planets, so go figure. So there was definitely something else going on there. But when I visited his environment the first time, that sort of sense of like just stuff going on everywhere, you were definitely like had stepped through a portal. You'd gone into this whole other world that was manifested right here in the real concrete world that you and I live in. And every time I'd go back to Finster's place or to St. Ohm's place or to some of these other places I've discovered since then, you get that sense. It's like, wow, You must go to Passaquan. You should make a special visit to Georgia. Passaquan has been that's St. Ohm's environment, has been completely restored. The Kohler Foundation from Wisconsin put, untold amounts of money into full restoration of that place. Finster's place is built on a swamp and had deteriorated quite a lot, but a lot of it has been brought back and dug out of the swamp. And, I think it would certainly be useful to you, a lot of fun for you to do as well. Yeah. So on another trip to the south.
Yeah, we're headed back there in October.
Oh, great. That's so great. Yeah. To Passaquan?
We'll be staying on a farm that's just outside of Milledgeville, so it's not that far.
Great. Yeah. Milledgeville, Flannery O'Connor country.
Yeah.
You should go visit her farm because it's now open to the public now. It's called
Andalusia?
Andalusia, exactly.
Yeah, there's so much art happening there. Yeah. I really feel
so that was my tradition before I discovered psychedelics or any of that, or when I was starting out to become a writer. I was reading people like Flannery O'Connor. My grandfather knew William Faulkner in North Mississippi. So I was like reading Faulkner, I was reading Eudora Welty, and so I came out of that real Southern storytelling tradition. Those people are still, really important to me.
Isn't that interesting that I feel like things can be psychedelic that are not inherently, that you don't have to experience psychedelic chemicals or substances to even just recognize that some things are psychedelic or transportive.
Or spiritual, It's that business it's that shamanic thing about, everything's alive. If you want to call them spiritual forces, there are conscious entities, it's like everything is alive. That piece of wood is alive, a rock is alive. Certainly plants, I'm always very attuned to plant consciousness when I'm taking psychedelics, and I'm aware of it otherwise because of that, Plants are very much alive and communicating all the time. They're communicating with each other, and I think they communicate with us if we open ourselves to it. One way to communicate with plants is to eat them. Then they really talk to you, certain plants.
So in that period of your life where you were kind of like running with a beat culture a bit, you were hanging out with poets, and were you traveling a lot?
So from, I'd say 75, 76, I was kind of footloose. I had been out of college for a couple of years. I'd had a straight job working for a little small town newspaper near Chapel Hill, first year out of college. And I had worked as a PR guy for my alma mater for a semester. And then I just cut myself loose and had this couple of years where I was really just exploring. I lived on a farm with some hippie friends in Tennessee for a while, and then I went down to Guatemala with an earthquake relief group out of Mohawk Nation, mostly Native Americans, and we went into a little traditional. I'd done a lot of reading about American Indians. I was very interested in that period of my life, and I was really, really interested in the pre-Columbian architecture and art and I wanted to go see those things firsthand. And I also wanted to like have contact with traditional Indians who were living in small communities. So I went down there, and instead of doing the tourist thing and staying in hotels, I would go to these little out of the way places and pay people 50 cents to string a hammock in their little outbuilding, their little cane roofed outbuilding or whatever, and learn a little bit of the native language. And so I spent a month on an earthquake relief project that was run by Indians in Guatemala, in a very traditional Indian village. And then after that, I stayed down there and met a friend from the States who came down to meet me, and we traveled. Of course, Mexico City is one huge archaeological site. It's built on this ancient pre-Columbian city. And the parts of it that have been dug up and restored there are just absolutely incredible. So I was doing a lot of that, and finally basically was running out of money, and decided I needed to sort of like plant a flag somewhere. So I had good contacts in Atlanta, and I ended up moving there, and things just kind of fell into place for me there. I had enough of a support structure there, and I immediately started meeting artists, poets, and kindred spirits there. I started a little small press there. I published poetry, and I started writing for this travel magazine, and my first writing about Finster at St. Home, and some of the other visionary artists that I met in Georgia. Jonathan Williams, a tremendously important figure for me, who had started this unconventional publishing house called the Jargon Society, and they published the St. Owen book. And he was the first other person that I met who was interested in these places and these visionary artists. I knew about a few places in the South, and I didn't really know how to talk about them or anything. And he had been to places in France and Italy, and he'd been to the Watchtowers in Los Angeles. And so I moved to Winston-Salem because he hired me to work for his press and to run a 3-year project researching some of these artists. So that's how I came to Winston-Salem from Atlanta in 1984, and I was paid a half-time salary to just work on my St. Owen book and my Finster book and travel around and meet some of these other artists. And so, I think once you put yourself on the path, if you're really like there, it'll develop. That's certainly the way it happened for me.
I'm so glad y'all joined us again for this conversation. As I said, hang around after this. He read an excerpt from his forthcoming memoir, which is conditionally titled Chance Operations, Cultural Adventures of a Fledgling Scribe. And he describes that experience in Huautla with the curandera in more detail. He also sent me a couple of the books that he mentioned that he wanted to reference for anybody that wants to do a deeper dive on African American spiritual traditions. One of them is Robert Farris Thompson's Flash of the Spirit, and the other is an anthology called Souls Grown Deep, African American Vernacular Art from Tinwood Books. Another book that Tom said was incredibly influential to his journey and remains really pertinent for him today is Gordon Wasson's The Wondrous Mushroom. As many of you, I'm sure, know, Wasson was one of the first Westerners to go down to Mexico and discover the tradition of psilocybin healing practices that had been alive there for a very, very long time. The article he published about it in 1957 in Life magazine really opened the door to so many Westerners, including very famously the Beatles, to go down to Mexico and experience it themselves. And that article should be pretty easy to find for free online at this point. I really encourage you to find Tom's work as well. You can find his email, as I said, in the description below, and you can always find me at marajames.com and on Instagram at marajames and unbroken.chain, where I curate visual art, a lot of it outsider and folk art as well. I'm looking forward to seeing you beauties next week. I hope you're dwelling in the magic until then. And if you have just the tiniest inkling to pick up a pen, if you're humming a song in the shower and think, I should grab my phone and record that for a second, do it. Take the time to honor the transmissions that come through you. Don't worry about what it's for or what it means. Just play. Just play and see what blooms. All right, here's Tom reading an excerpt from his memoir, and we'll have so much more so soon. Love you.
Erasmus remained characteristically quiet during my exchange with Santiago and Senora Sanchez. She's the curandera. But he looked dubious as we entered the carpentry shop, a single room illuminated by a bare bulb suspended from the ceiling on a cord above the work table at one end of the room. Santiago handed Erasmus and me a couple of roughly hand-woven woolen blankets and directed us to the unfurnished corner he had designated as the site for our velada. Velada means evening, and it's what they use. It's the way they talk about their evening ceremonies. They always take place at night. Following his suggestion, Santiago's suggestion, we spread the blankets on the dirt floor, meanwhile carefully clutching our leaf-wrapped mushrooms. Erasmus and I sat down on the blanketed dirt floor, as did the young woman. Still cradling her child, she reached her free hand into a woven bag slung over her shoulder. From it, she removed a tripod bowl carved from what looked like pumice. She also took out a small paper bag and from it poured into the bowl a few briquettes of copal, which is a pine incense that's traditionally used in Indian communities throughout Mesoamerica. Santiago handed us a couple more folded blankets in case we needed to lie down, he explained. Then, evidently following the young mother's instructions in Mazatec, he ignited a wooden match and lit a piece of the copal in the incense burner. By this time, the sick baby had awakened and started to whimper. I asked the child's name. Santiago translated my question, and the curandera said, Luis, un niño, a boy. As she rocked him gently, trying to quiet him, Santiago explained to us in Spanish how the velada was to proceed. After we ate the mushrooms, La Señora would say a prayer and begin her consultation with us, and she would also sing some songs and chants. From outside, there was a sudden explosion of thunder, and we could see in the room's two small windows the simultaneous flash of lightning, seemingly right on top of us. El Niño began crying more loudly, and his mother continued rocking and speaking to him softly in Mazatec. Meanwhile, we heard the spatters of rain hitting the roof and the ground outside, quickly building in crescendo to a steady roar. As the crying softened and subsided, the young curandera turned her eyes toward us, nodded, and said 2 or 3 words that Santiago translated as an invitation to eat the mushrooms. Erasmus and I unwrapped the banana leaves to find our hands full of fresh, still damp, rubbery-feeling mushrooms, clumps of them obviously pulled directly from the ground and glommed together with bits of black dirt still clinging to some of them. She says to eat all of them and eat the dirt too, Santiago translated, as she continued to advise and comment. Is she going to eat any? Erasmus wondered aloud. I don't think so, I surmised. She has to take care of her sick baby. As I began to eat the prodigious quantity of mushrooms I had been issued, I asked what kind of mushrooms they were. Hearing Santiago's translations, he answered in Spanish, Es el derrumbe. Landslide, I translated before Santiago could say it. So we slowly ate los hongos derrumbe, pausing to chase every other bite with halazone-treated water from our canteens. The fungi's unappetizing, bitterish taste, I quickly noticed, was much like that of the psilocybe cubensis we knew from back in the Carolinas and Georgia. By the time we downed our allotted mushrooms, the baby had evidently fallen asleep. The outdoor sounds of a steady rain and occasional rumbles of thunder continued as the curandera offered her Christian invocation prayer in what sounded like an amalgam of Mazatec and Spanish, with repeated references to Dios and Jesucristo. Then, as Santiago translated, she invited us to tell her what troubled us, what illness might she work to cure, or what problem might she help us to solve. In rather awkward, grammatically flawed Spanish, I tried to communicate to her that we weren't seeking to cure anyone or solve any particular problem, but were simply interested in learning about the mushrooms, how the Huastecas used them, and what they believed about them. I said we had similar mushrooms where we lived, but we had no traditions to let us know how to use them. Looking bewildered by Santiago's translation of my comments, she spoke a few Mazatec words, which he rendered as an invitation for any questions we might want to ask her. We wanted to know, I told him, where the mushrooms came from and what they were for. La Señora's answer: the mushrooms are the blood of Jesus. They're for curing sickness and finding things that are lost. I said we hadn't seen our families in a long time, and we wanted to know if she could tell us if our parents and siblings were all well. She silently pondered the request for a moment that was suddenly broken by another loud thunderclap. Her child started crying again, and she resumed the steady rocking motion that had previously soothed him. She spoke briefly in Mazatec, more loudly than before, to be heard over the crying. She said she thinks your families are in good health, Santiago translated, and she hopes they are all happy. Muchas gracias, señora, I responded. Estoy alegre a conocer eso. I'm happy to know this. She nodded, still rocking her baby, whose crying voice I suddenly noticed had begun to sound like a croaking wail of an alien tree frog, communicating a message not translatable into human language, but somehow related to the sweet smoke smell suddenly permeating the room. I was quickly beginning to feel the mushroom's effects. A low, sustained timpani roll of thunder introduced the onrush of heavier rainfall and a sudden loss of light from the room, which I took to be the result of a power outage. We were plunged into pitch darkness. The alien tree frog wail subsided as the curandera began to chant a high-pitched sing-song mix of Mazatec and Spanish. As I listened to her ancient songs and the rainstorm roar, my eyes fixed on a glowing red pinpoint radiating out of the blackness. No sooner had I convinced myself that I was looking at the slowly burning chunk of copal than it started moving and changing colors. Then, like the tip of a sharp, phosphorescently glowing crayon, it began to draw sinuous lines in the blackness. Somehow it multiplied exponentially, so that myriad glowing pinpoints in prismatic colors were simultaneously tracing lines around the void dark space, all working together to create a three-dimensional black light scene, an interior view of an intricate crystalline dome, each component of which appeared to give off its own light. I found myself gazing straight into this marvelous architecture's pinnacle, floating in zero gravity and moving slowly closer to what I thought was the dome's central interior, when I suddenly realized that my surroundings were rapidly reordering themselves. Animated Asian and Mesoamerican temples, exotic landscapes, details shifting as new forms continued to emerge. Sculpted totems of mythical beings morphed into dense clusters of hanging vines and tropic jungles, which revealed themselves as weathered rock formations in the sides of deep canyons viewed from the eyes of birds gliding high above in opalescent heaven. Day becomes night, a spray of glittering stars revealed against a lapis lazuli void, then merged into rose pink and marigold orange of warp speed dawn. All developments accelerated in a time tunnel of ceaseless transformation, onrush of the world's visual history, unspooling in serial circumnavigations. Clown riot on an endless spiral staircase, burning trail of an orbiting comet amid vast depth of constellation space, this panoply of views sung into being by the a cappella choir of interstellar seraphim. I later calculated that I followed this procession of metamorphosing imagery in the darkness for 3 to 4 hours while stretched out on the floor of Don Alejandro's shop. Time's passage was irrelevant and unnoticed while the experience was in process, unfolding toward a kind of resolution in a lush garden park where I found myself for a suspended interval of nocturnal delight. Glowing stone-paved pathways wound their way among a profusion of richly foliated, prolifically blooming trees, vines, and other plants growing from ground carpeted in a patchwork of variegated green mosses. My airborne bird's eye saw that all meandering pathways led to the only edifice in view, a crystal gazebo just large enough to accommodate a lone young woman resembling a dark-eyed princess in an Indian miniature painting, gracefully moving her hands as if playing an invisible instrument to accompany her vocals, the song chants I had been hearing throughout our velada experience. A mushroom goddess in an enchanted mind garden. At some point the singing stopped, and a tongue of flame flickered into existence on the periphery of my vision field, illuminating a wooden match and the small brown feminine hand that held it. And the small brown feminine hand that held it, then transferred itself to the wick of a white votive candle on a ceramic saucer, where it glowed more brightly, revealing in shadowy form the details of the curandera's coppery face, the red face of her sleeping infant, and the folds and wrinkles of their handmade wool and cotton clothing. Also revealing our own recognizable features, my veiny, long-fingered hands and cross-legged lower body turned toward the 2 light sources, and Erasmus's legs stretch out in the same direction, faded blue denim and sturdy lace-up hiking boots that looked made for walking on the moon. Glancing over my left shoulder, I saw he was propped up on his elbows, with the candle flame reflected in his normally prominent eyes, which were wide and dilated as he watched whatever he might have been seeing at that moment. As the candlelight flickered, Senora Sanchez spoke some words in Mazatec, and it was only then that I noticed Santiago, who had apparently been quietly sitting throughout the session in a chair near his father's work table. He approached us from the shadows in that part of the room and began translating as he knelt to meet us at eye level. "She says it is late and she must take her child home now," he told us in Spanish. He also mentioned that it was customary to give her a tip if we approved of the service she had performed for us. We had already paid her. I fumbled for my army gas mask bag, pulled a Mexican bill from my wallet, and thanked her as I handed it to her. Erasmus likewise tipped and thanked her. Her child stirred and began whimpering again as she got to her feet. "Muchas gracias para ayudarnos," I told Santiago as Erasmus and I stood up a bit shakily. "Thank you for helping us." Realizing that he too expected a tip, we obliged. Then he opened the door and extinguished the candle, and we all stepped outside. The rain had stopped. Juanita Sanchez and her child quickly disappeared. Santiago bid us good night and cautioned us to be careful. Then he crossed the courtyard and entered his family's dark house. The velada had ended, but our mushroom trip was definitely still in progress. Every visible surface glistened with rainwater, reflecting what little available light there was. Erasmus and I stood outside the threshold of the carpentry shop, which was on the uphill side of the little compound. From that same vantage point a few hours earlier, we had been able to look down on much of Huautla, with its closely situated adobe houses and other small buildings spread out along the adjacent hillsides and narrow dirt streets leading down into the center of town. But at that moment we were treated instead to a panoramic view of fog, a sea of dense pale clouds in which myriad light pinpoints formed an array of unfamiliar constellations. I was momentarily disoriented by the sense that I was looking into a bright-starred sky on a cloudy night, when I expected to be looking down the mountainside toward the center of Huautla. I concentrated on the pull of gravity in order to steady myself. "What is that?" Erasmus sounded similarly confused but awestruck. "What is what?" I asked. He laughed and he said, "That, whatever it is we're seeing, if you're seeing what I'm seeing." What I was seeing was changing before my eyes, as so many things had been doing all night. The bank of clouds over Huautla was sinking, and the view of the town was re-emerging as the twinkling pinpoints turned into the illuminated bulbs of streetlights. But instead of the tile-roofed adobe houses I had seen earlier, there was a view of minarets, domes, and tiers of buildings in a traditional Moorish style. As I stood there quietly marveling at this vista, the clouds began rising, and soon had once again completely obscured Huautla's architecture. Despite the dense fog, our eyes adjusted to the minimal light, and we began walking slowly down the wet, mud-puddled pathway to the little street that passed in front of Santiago's family's house. No one else was outside in this part of town, so the neighborhood dogs were immediately alert to our presence. We didn't see them, just as they probably couldn't see us, but we heard them barking, and it sounded exactly like they were saying, "Huautla! Huautla! Huautla!" The clouds slowly began sinking again, and soon I noticed a rhythmic pattern to their rising and sinking. It was as if the earth was slowly breathing, and the clouds moving in accordance, in and out, rising and falling. Every time the clouds sank, a different set of buildings emerged on the hillsides below. The Moorish architecture turned into Japanese pagodas and vertically elongated Cambodian-style pyramids. A few minutes later, they looked like European Gothic towers and steeples propped up with flying buttresses. At one point, I seemed to be looking straight down into the wooded suburban Georgia neighborhood where I grew up and where my parents and youngest sister still lived. I don't think I said a word as I marveled at these architectural transformations, and Erasmus was likewise immersed in a seemingly rapt silence. I have no idea how long we stayed out there. I felt lost in history, lost in space, alive beyond death, and entirely unconcerned with finding my way back to familiar territory and temporal order.